At 6:17 on the morning of February 8, 1984, Frank Kowalski stood in front of a rusted junkyard gates on the outskirts of Allentown, Pennsylvania, watching the dawn break over 40 acres of abandoned metal. 63 years old, 38 years underground in the coal mines, zero experience in business. The junkyard had been closed for 18 months. The previous owner had died. His family wanted nothing to do with it. The city had declared it a hazard. Environmental violations, unpaid taxes, contaminated soil. Everyone agreed the property was worthless. Frank disagreed. He'd brought something with him that morning. A bank envelope containing $12,000, his entire savings from 4 decades of mining work. In his coat pocket was a handwritten offer he'd typed himself on his daughter's typewriter. By noon, he'd either own 40 acres of scrap metal or lose everything he'd saved since 1946. The bank didn't know he was making an offer. His wife didn't know. His children didn't know. If this failed, his family would lose their security. If it succeeded, Frank would prove that discarded things still held value if someone knew how to see it. The scrap metal crisis had started in 1979. The steel industry had collapsed. Mills across Pennsylvania had closed. Bethlehem Steel had laid off 15,000 workers. Jones and Laughlin had shuttered 3 plants. The entire industrial infrastructure of the Rust Belt was dying. Scrap metal prices had fallen from $140 per ton to $31 per ton in 4 years. Junkyards couldn't sell inventory. Operating costs exceeded revenue. Most yards closed. The metal sat rusting in open air. Millions of tons of steel, copper, aluminum, brass, worthless at current market prices, but Frank understood something about markets that most businessmen didn't. Nothing stayed cheap forever. Prices moved in cycles. What collapsed eventually recovered. The question wasn't whether steel would come back. The question was when, and whether you could survive long enough to profit from the recovery. Frank had survived 38 years underground. He knew about patience. He knew about waiting through dark times for conditions to improve. Coal mining had taught him that survival mattered more than speed. He'd grown up in anthracite country, Scranton, Pennsylvania, 1921. His father had worked the mines. His grandfather had worked the mines. Frank started working underground at 16. No other options. The Depression had killed every other job. Mining paid $4 per day. Dangerous work. Cave-ins killed men every month. Black lung killed them slowly over decades. Frank had seen both. Lost friends to explosions. Watched his father die at 54, lungs destroyed by coal dust. But Frank had survived. Careful work, attention to detail. Never took unnecessary risks. Always checked the timbers before entering a tunnel. Always tested for gas. Slow, methodical approach that kept him alive when faster miners died. By 1984, he'd worked 38 years underground without serious injury. That record meant something. It meant his judgment was sound. His risk assessment was accurate. His patience was reliable. He'd retired in 1983, age 62. Union pension paid $890 per month. Social Security added $640. Total income $1,530 monthly. His house was paid off. His wife Helen worked part-time at the library. $380 per month. Combined household income, $1,910. They could survive, live quietly, watch television, visit grandchildren. That was the expected path for retired miners. Frank didn't want it. He'd spent 38 years underground watching rich men make money from other people's labor. Mine owners, steel executives. They'd gotten wealthy while miners got black lung. Frank wasn't bitter. Bitterness didn't change anything. But he'd learned how wealth actually worked. It wasn't about working harder. It was about owning things. Assets, resources, things other people needed. The mine owners didn't work harder than miners. They just owned the coal. That ownership generated wealth. Frank wanted to own something. He'd started looking at distressed assets in 1983, properties nobody wanted. The market was full of them. Abandoned factories, closed warehouses, shuttered junkyards. Industrial Pennsylvania was dying. Everything was for sale. But most properties had problems. Environmental contamination, structural damage, unpaid taxes, legal complications. The problems scared away conventional buyers, left opportunities for unconventional buyers. The junkyard on Route 22 had caught Frank's attention in December 1983. He'd driven past it for years, knew the owner. Chester Novak, old Polish guy, ran the yard for 40 years. Died in July 1983. Heart attack. His children lived in California. They'd inherited the property, but didn't want it. Couldn't sell it. The scrap metal market was dead. The property had environmental issues. Old transformer oil had contaminated soil. EPA regulations required cleanup. Estimated cost $80,000. The property wasn't worth that much. But Frank had studied the numbers. He'd gone to the county courthouse, reviewed property records. The land was 40 acres, zoned industrial, located on a main highway, rail spur access, good location for distribution. The scrap metal inventory was substantial. Approximately 2,400 tons of various metals, steel, aluminum, copper, brass. Current market value at $31 per ton, $74,400. But Frank wasn't interested in current market value. He was interested in future market value. He'd researched steel prices going back to 1950. The patterns were clear. Prices cycled. They crashed during recessions. They recovered during expansions. The average cycle lasted 7 to 9 years. The current crash had started in 1979. It was 1984, 5 years into the cycle. Recovery would come within 2 to 4 years, maybe sooner if the economy improved. Frank calculated what the scrap metal would be worth at normal prices. Historical average, $120 per ton. 2,400 tons at 120, $288,000. If he could buy the property cheaply and hold the inventory until prices recovered, he'd make substantial profit. The question was how cheaply he could buy it. Chester Novak's children had listed the property for $85,000, no offers. They dropped the price to $65,000, no offers. Then $45,000, still no offers. Nobody wanted a contaminated junkyard with $74,400 in worthless scrap metal and $80,000 in cleanup liability. The math didn't work. But Frank saw different math. He'd contacted the family directly, bypassed real estate agents, explained his situation. Retired miner, limited savings, cash buyer, could close quickly. He'd offered $12,000. The family had laughed initially, then reconsidered. They were paying property taxes, $3,200 per year, insurance, $1,800 per year, legal fees for estate settlement. The property was costing them money every month. They couldn't sell it. $12,000 was better than continuing to lose money. They'd countered at $18,000. Frank didn't have $18,000. He had $12,000. He'd explained this. Cash, immediate closing, no contingencies. Take it or keep paying taxes. The family had accepted. Settlement was scheduled for February 8, 1984, 10 a.m. Frank needed to be at the attorney's office with $12,000 in certified funds. He'd told Helen 2 days earlier. She'd been upset, not angry, scared. $12,000 was everything they'd saved. If Frank failed, they had no backup, no savings, just pension and Social Security. Helen asked what would happen if scrap metal prices didn't recover. Frank said they would recover. Economics always cycled. Helen asked when. Frank said he didn't know exactly, but he'd wait as long as necessary. They owned their house. They had income. They could survive while waiting. Helen had nodded. She'd been married to Frank for 41 years. She trusted his judgment. If he said it would work, it would work. The settlement took 40 minutes. Frank signed 17 documents, paid $12,000, received the deed. He owned 40 acres, 2,400 tons of scrap metal, one broken-down office shack. No employees, no equipment, no plan beyond waiting for prices to recover. He drove to the property that afternoon, walked the entire 40 acres. The metal was organized poorly. Steel mixed with aluminum, copper scattered everywhere. No sorting system. Chester Novak had been old school, took whatever people brought, threw it in piles, sold it when prices were good. That approach had worked for 40 years. It wouldn't work now. Frank needed a system. He spent 3 weeks studying junkyard operations, visited 11 active yards, asked questions. How did they sort metal? How did they price inventory? What equipment did they use? Most operators were helpful. They didn't see Frank as competition. A 63-year-old retired miner with one junkyard wasn't a threat. Frank absorbed everything, took notes, drew diagrams, calculated costs. He needed equipment. Sorting required machinery. A magnet crane for separating ferrous metals, cutting torches for breaking down large pieces, scales for weighing inventory, forklifts for moving material. Used equipment was available. Other junkyards were closing, liquidating assets. Frank bought a magnet crane for $3,800. 2 cutting torches for $240, a certified scale for $890, 1 forklift for $2,100. Total equipment investment $7,030. But Frank had only spent $12,000 buying the property. He didn't have $7,030 for equipment. He needed financing. Banks wouldn't loan money against a junkyard. Too risky. Frank tried credit unions. Rejected. He tried equipment leasing companies. Rejected. Finally, he approached his brother-in-law, Ed Kowalski, owned a small plumbing business. Frank explained the situation. Ed listened, then offered a deal. Ed would loan Frank $7,000 at 8% interest, 2-year term. Frank would pay $300 per month. If Frank defaulted, Ed would take ownership of the equipment. Simple terms. Frank accepted. He bought the equipment in March 1984. Spent April and May reorganizing the junkyard, sorting metal by type, steel in one area, aluminum in another, copper segregated, brass separated, creating inventory systems, tracking weights, documenting what he had. The work was physical, harder than Frank expected. He was 63. Decades underground had worn his body down. His back hurt constantly. His hands were arthritic. But he worked 6 days per week, 10 hours per day, alone. Couldn't afford employees. Helen helped on weekends, doing paperwork, answering phone calls. The junkyard's old office had a rotary phone, one line. Customers called occasionally, trying to sell scrap. Frank quoted prices based on current market rates, usually couldn't offer enough. Sellers went elsewhere. Frank didn't care. He wasn't buying. He was organizing. By June 1984, the junkyard was systematized. 2,400 tons of sorted, documented inventory. Frank knew exactly what he owned. 1,680 tons of steel, 420 tons of aluminum, 180 tons of copper, 120 tons of brass and mixed metals. Current market value? Still approximately $74,400. No change. Prices hadn't moved. But Frank wasn't concerned. The organization mattered. When prices recovered, he'd be ready to sell efficiently. Scrap metal prices bottomed out in August 1984. $28 per ton for steel, lowest in 15 years. Several more junkyards closed that month, couldn't sustain operations. Frank's property taxes came due, $3,200. He paid from his pension. Helen's library income covered household expenses. They were surviving, barely. Frank's brother-in-law called in September, asked how business was going. Frank said it wasn't. No sales, just waiting. Ed asked if Frank could make the loan payments. Frank said yes. His pension covered it. Ed seemed satisfied. The first sign of recovery came in November 1984. Steel prices ticked up, $31 per ton to $34 per ton. Small increase, probably temporary, but Frank noticed. He started watching prices daily, reading industry publications, tracking market indicators. The economy was improving. Reagan's policies were stimulating growth. Manufacturing was picking up slightly. Demand for steel was increasing incrementally. By February 1985, steel hit $42 per ton. Frank's inventory value had increased to $102,480. Paper profit, $28,080. But Frank wasn't selling. The recovery was just starting. Historical averages suggested steel would reach $120 per ton, maybe higher if the recovery was strong. Frank waited. But the mill buyer told other people. Word spread through the industry. There was a junkyard in Allentown. Old guy, retired miner, had clean inventory, wouldn't sell at current prices, was waiting for the market to peak. Other buyers called. Frank declined every offer. Prices kept rising. $48 per ton in April, $54 per ton in May, $61 per ton in June. Frank's inventory was now worth $145,680. Paper profit, $145,680. His original $12,000 investment had generated 6 times return. But only on paper. Frank still wasn't selling. He'd studied the historical cycles. Prices typically peaked at $115 to $130 per ton. Current price of $61 was still below average. He waited. Helen asked him in July if he was sure. They could sell now, lock in profits, pay off the equipment loan, have money left over. Frank said he was sure. The cycle wasn't complete. Helen trusted him. They kept waiting. Steel hit $72 per ton in September 1985, $79 per ton in November. By January 1986, it reached $88 per ton. Frank's inventory, $211,200. Paper profit, $136,800. Still not peak. Frank continued waiting. His patience was legendary now. Other junkyard operators watched in amazement. This retired miner was outperforming every professional in the business, not through superior knowledge, through superior patience. The peak came in May 1986. Steel hit $124 per ton. Frank's inventory, $297,600. Paper profit, $223,200. This was the moment. Frank started selling. He called his contacts, negotiated prices, moved inventory systematically, sold 1,680 tons of steel over 6 weeks. Revenue, $208,320. Then sold aluminum at $280 per ton. Revenue, $117,600. Then copper at $1,840 per ton. Revenue, $331,200. Finally, brass at $1,620 per ton. Revenue, $194,400. Total revenue from selling entire inventory, $851,520. Original investment, $12,000. Equipment costs, $7,000. Operating expenses over 27 months, approximately $18,000. Total investment, $37,000. Total profit, $814,520. Frank Kowalski had turned $12,000 into $851,520 in 27 months, a 7,096% return. One of the most successful commodity investments in Pennsylvania history, achieved by a 63-year-old retired coal miner with no business training. Just patience, timing, and refusal to panic. But Frank didn't cash out and retire. He understood something profound. The cycle would repeat. Markets would crash again. Opportunities would return. He used his profits to buy more properties, 3 more junkyards, 2 closed factories, an abandoned warehouse, all distressed, all cheap. He bought them between 1986 and 1989 for a total of $320,000, renovated them, systematized operations, built inventory, waited for the next cycle. The recession hit in 1990. Steel prices crashed again, from $118 per ton to $39 per ton. Frank's properties lost 65% of their paper value. Other investors panicked, sold at losses. Frank waited. He'd seen this before, knew it would recover. His patience was rewarded. By 1994, prices had recovered to $105 per ton. Frank's portfolio was worth $3.2 million. He started hiring employees in 1991, couldn't manage 5 properties alone, hired former miners mostly, men his age, Men who'd lost jobs when the mines closed. Paid them well. $15 per hour, benefits, treated them with respect. His workforce grew to 23 employees by 1995. They were loyal. Frank was loyal back. Never laid anyone off, even during downturns. He had reserves, could weather slow periods. The business expanded beyond scrap metal in 1996. Frank started buying industrial equipment, machinery from closed factories, reconditioned it, sold it to manufacturers in Mexico and South America. North American factories were closing. Developing countries needed equipment. Frank provided it. New profit center. Diversification beyond scrap metal cycles. By 2000, Frank's portfolio had grown to 11 properties, 4 junkyards, 3 warehouses, 2 distribution centers, 2 equipment refurbishment facilities, employed 67 people, annual revenue $18 million, annual profit $4.2 million. Frank was 79 years old. He'd built a $22 million company from $12,000 and 27 months of patience. But Frank never changed his lifestyle. Still lived in the same house he'd bought in 1958, drove a 1987 Ford pickup, wore work clothes to the office every day, ate lunch from a metal lunchbox Helen packed. No pretense, no luxury, just work. His employees respected that. The boss wasn't better than them. He'd been a miner. He understood their lives. Frank's wealth grew quietly. He reinvested profits, bought more properties, built more inventory, hired more workers. The company became the largest scrap metal operation in eastern Pennsylvania. Competitors studied his methods, tried copying his patience. Most couldn't. They needed quarterly profits, couldn't wait years for cycles to peak. Frank could. He had no shareholders, no investors, no pressure, just his own judgment. The financial crisis of 2008 created massive opportunities. Steel prices crashed from $410 per ton to $120 per ton in 9 months. Hundreds of scrap operations failed, went bankrupt, their assets sold at liquidation prices. Frank bought 14 more properties between 2008 and 2010. Total investment, $8.4 million. He was 87 years old, still working, still patient, still waiting for recovery. The recovery came faster than expected. By 2011, steel hit $380 per ton. Frank's inventory from the crash period, worth $41 million. Paper profit, $23 million. He sold systematically, realized gains over 3 years. Revenue, $38 million. Profit, $21 million. At age 90, Frank Kowalski had executed the largest scrap metal trade in Pennsylvania history. But Frank's legacy extended beyond profits. His company had become crucial infrastructure, employed 134 people by 2012, paid $11.8 million in annual wages, provided health insurance, retirement benefits, training programs. Some employees had worked there 20 years, raised families on those wages, bought houses, sent kids to college. The stability mattered. Rust Belt, Pennsylvania had few stable employers. Frank's company was one. He'd also revolutionized scrap metal operations, his sorting systems, his inventory management, his patient approach to market timing. Industry publications studied his methods. Trade schools taught his techniques. He'd proven that scrap metal wasn't just disposal. It was sophisticated commodity trading, requiring patience, discipline, and long-term thinking. Frank retired in 2014 at age 93, transferred ownership to his 3 children, equal shares. The company was worth $47 million. Annual revenue, $63 million. Annual profit, $14 million. Employed 156 people. Frank's children promised to maintain his principles: patient investing, fair wages, community commitment. They've honored that promise. The company continues operating today. Frank died in September 2019, age 98. Complications from pneumonia. His funeral drew more than 600 people. Employees, former employees, competitors, city officials, people whose lives he'd changed, not through charity, but through opportunity. He'd created jobs, paid fairly, treated people with dignity, built something that lasted. The obituaries in Pennsylvania newspapers focused on his business success. Retired miner turns $12,000 into $47 million empire. Rags to riches story. American dream achieved. But the people who'd worked for Frank remembered something different. They remembered that he'd treated them like equals. Never forgot he'd been underground for 38 years. Never pretended wealth made him better. Just different circumstances, different timing. His company renamed its headquarters the Frank Kowalski Center in 2020. Modest building, nothing fancy. Office space, meeting rooms. Employees work there daily. Small brass plaque by the entrance. Frank Kowalski, 1921 to 1919. He saw value where others saw waste. Business schools occasionally study the Kowalski case. MBA programs analyze his investment timing, his patience, his contrarian approach. Most students miss the critical element. Frank succeeded because he'd spent 38 years underground. That experience taught him to wait through darkness for conditions to improve. Taught him that survival mattered more than speed. Taught him that good judgment required patience. Those lessons transferred perfectly to commodity trading. Mining and scrap metal weren't obviously connected, but the skills overlapped. Assessing risk, timing decisions, working methodically, never panicking, understanding cycles. Frank's mining career prepared him for business success. Just took 38 years to recognize the connection. The Rust Belt's industrial collapse created thousands of opportunities similar to Frank's junkyard. Abandoned properties, distressed assets, worthless inventory. Most people saw problems. Frank saw timing. He understood that industrial cycles didn't end. They paused, reconfigured, resumed. Pennsylvania's factories weren't permanently dead. They were hibernating, waiting for economic conditions to shift. Some never recovered. Some did. Frank's insight was distinguishing between permanent decline and temporary depression. Scrap metal was temporarily depressed. The underlying demand existed. Manufacturing would eventually resume. Steel would be needed. The timing was uncertain, but the eventual recovery was probable. Frank bet on probability, waited patiently, won decisively. Other investors lacked his patience. needed faster returns, couldn't wait 27 months for a cycle to complete. Frank could. He had his pension, his paid-off house, no debt, no pressure. That financial independence enabled patient investing. The irony was profound. Frank's modest lifestyle, paid-off house, minimal expenses, created the foundation for extraordinary wealth. Living simply enabled patient capital deployment. That patience generated returns that complex strategies couldn't match. His children maintained the business carefully. Same principles: patient investing, long-term thinking, fair treatment of employees. The company doesn't maximize short-term profit. It optimizes long-term sustainability. That approach seems old-fashioned in modern business culture, but it works. The company remains profitable, remains stable, remains important to its community. Frank's grandchildren work in the business now, third generation. They never met the retired miner who started it all. They know the stories, heard about the $12,000 investment, the 27-month wait, the $851,520 profit. It sounds like myth, like exaggeration, but the documents exist. The transaction records, the property deeds, the sales receipts, all real, all documented, all proof that one retired miner with no business training outperformed professional investors through pure patience. The scrap metal industry changed after Frank's success. More sophisticated inventory management, better market timing, longer investment horizons. His influence was indirect but significant. He'd proven that patience worked, that waiting through cycles generated superior returns, that distressed assets weren't worthless, just mispriced. That insight spread, changed how the industry operated. Pennsylvania's industrial landscape remains difficult. Many communities never recovered from the steel industry's collapse. Jobs disappeared permanently. Young people left. Infrastructure deteriorated. But some communities stabilized. Allentown was one. Frank's company provided stable employment, paid property taxes, supported local businesses. His success didn't reverse regional decline, but it created an anchor, a reason for some people to stay, a source of stability in unstable times. If this story moves you the way it moves us, consider what Frank proved, that ordinary people with patience and judgment can succeed where sophisticated investors fail, that working-class experience transfers to business contexts, that $12,000 and 27 months of waiting can generate extraordinary returns, that age isn't a barrier to starting new ventures, that quiet persistence beats flashy strategies. Frank Kowalski never wrote a book, never gave interviews, never promoted his success, just worked quietly for 35 years, built a $47 million company, employed hundreds of people, changed how an industry thought about timing and patience, all from standing in front of a rusted junkyard gate at 6:17 on a February morning in 1984. You don't need Frank's exact circumstances. You need his perspective, that markets cycle, that patience beats speed, that distressed assets are often mispriced, that working-class judgment is valuable, that age and experience matter, that modest living enables patient investing, that refusing to panic during crashes creates opportunity. Frank would tell you to find your junkyard, your abandoned property, your distressed asset that everyone considers worthless. Study it carefully. Calculate its recovery value. Buy it if the math works. Then wait. Ignore market noise. Ignore pressure to sell. Wait until the cycle completes. Realize gains systematically. Reinvest profits. Repeat. Simple strategy. Difficult execution. Requires patience most people lack. But Frank proved it works. The 156 people employed by his company prove it. The $47 million his children inherited proves it. The stable wages paid to Rust Belt workers prove it. Legacy doesn't require genius. It requires patience. Build something that outlasts you. Frank did. So can you.